Hey everybody! Welcome to the Improv and Innovation Cafe. Our episode today, I'm really excited about, but I'm excited about all our episodes because they're all fun. I can't pick a favorite because they're my children and they're all my favorite, and each in their own way. And you can check out the past episodes as well on my YouTube channel. If you look up Keeping It Human on YouTube, and it's also on my website. So what is the Improv and Innovation Cafe all about? Well, it's a place to hang out and have great conversations with experts who have a particular area of focus. They also happen to be improvisers, and they bring that sense of applied improvisational techniques to their work. Nobody ever says, hey, my improv is broken. I would love to get those calls. Nobody ever calls me and says that. So I'm a big believer that improv is a set of tools that we can apply to different situations in the business world to improve outcomes and get better performance and better outcomes. Mm-hmm. So if improv didn't make things better, then people like me and some of my guests, wouldn't be doing what we do. So I really put that emphasis on it because this is not about improv first and forcing our language on people who might be watching. It's really to answer the question, hey, I've got a business challenge. Can applying improv in some way help? And I believe the answer is yes. So we explore a lot of things under the marketing umbrella: communications, content marketing, strategic marketing. Today we're going to talk about presentations. And I'm Kat Koppett from Keeping It Human, your host. And if you want more information, you can go to keepingithuman.com. I'm a marketing storyteller. I use improv. There are tools in my toolbox. So whether the story challenge or marketing challenge is external with customers, or it's internal with employees or management or mission or organizational story, improv can help. And I'm really excited to play today with my friend and fellow improviser, Kat Koppett. So I'm going to introduce her as she deserves a proper introduction like all our guests. She's the author of Training to Imagine, Practical Improvisational Theater Techniques to Enhance Creativity, Teamwork, Leadership, and Learning. Kat applies improvisational theater techniques to the organizational stage to improve individual and group performance. And clients have included Facebook, JP Morgan Chase, Apple, Kaiser Permanente, Eli Lilly, to name a few. So welcome to the conversation, Kat.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so great to have fun people to chat. So this is going to be good. So let's jump on in. Why do you think, we chatted a little bit beforehand, before we went live. There's so much focus today on storytelling, which is a really beautiful thing. But a lot of the focus is on external storytelling with customers and brand storytelling in our content. But we don't see as much focus on presentations as a story within themselves. And why aren't we seeing that? Or are you seeing it?
Well, I think the people that approach me to do that work with them, or that I deliver the work to, are looking at it that way. I think one of the things we were talking about is how still balkanized or fractured this world of applied storytelling is. That there's a way in which it's delicious that there are, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people around sort of going, oh, storytelling, this ancient art of storytelling, yes. Storytelling, this way that our brain makes sense of the world, right, on every level. We could actually consciously think about that and apply it in organizational settings. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of different tracks. So I think if you're in a world of marketing and branding, and you conflate the idea of storytelling with what's our brand story, then you can get really good at that and go down that track and forget, in some ways, the universality of story as a tool.
Yeah, totally agreed, and that's such an important point, because story means so many things, and there's so many ways to tell stories, and there's so many stories to be told, from brand story to your organizational story, to your mission, to your why story, to the employee stories that your employees are telling, to internally and to the world. And there's just so many ways to think about story. But you're right. I think it seems like, at least if you look at the business literature today, certainly the marketing focus on content marketing seems to be external engagement with customers, and that's really important. But there's ways to think about story in all these other pockets, and I think it is changing. And I think people are becoming a little bit more aware of the power of storytelling versus just giving facts. At least in Silicon Valley, it feels that way. It feels like we're changing, not as fast as I would like it to.
But we're going to do our part, Kathy.
We're doing our part. We're doing our part. And I'm seeing more and more that, and the statistic I read was that the average VC, if we're talking about venture capital presentations, and that's just one area of presentation, but 6 minutes, the average VC is looking at your slide deck for 6 minutes. And certainly, I don't think that's unique. I think the average attention span today is just very short. And how are you telling that story, that full arc of what you need to say in a short amount of time? And are you telling, if it's a high stakes communication, are you telling stories?
Yeah. So there are 12 things I thought of as you were talking, but just talking about that last thing in terms of the size of your story and are you telling story, there are really two aspects that we look at in terms of good storytelling. And one is the narrative arc or the flow, the structure or the spine of the story. And then the other is the color or the detail or the detail. So in the world of improv, we call that coloring and advancing, right? What we work a lot with people on, what we coach people to do is to know the core of your story so clearly and so well that you can then expand or contract or stretch in various directions depending on the context. So I can go with an hour-long presentation and arrive on client site and they say, oh, I forgot about you, but walk me to the elevator and tell me your pitch as we're walking to the elevator. I should be able to do that. I should be able to say, what is that core beginning, middle, and end? Here's the moral of the story in this version as well as this version.
That is such a really important point. And that's worth stating again, because I was at an event not too long ago where it was a technology event where people were pitching their different products. And I had a client that was part of this event. And a lot of the pitches, people got really nervous and they relapsed to the data, talking about the data. And it struck me that, you can't overestimate the power of knowing your story viscerally so well, like inside and out. Forget about the data. If you know the heart and soul of your message, when the data fails you and you forget it, you still know the heart and soul of what you're trying to communicate. And that's the difference between trying to memorize something, which I think in this case is one particular group tried to memorize facts. And it didn't, and it showed because they couldn't reconnect once they lost their place and they got their facts jumbled. They lost the story of it. And I thought, that's it. You've got to know the heart and soul of your message.
Right. So data, so two things. One is if we roll back for a minute and say, what do we really mean by story?
Yeah.
So one of the very first presentations I ever gave at a conference was at the North American Simulation and Gaming Association conference. And I was giving a presentation on story because some other guy, Alain Rostand, the founder of the Applied Improv Network, was already doing improv. So they're like, can you do like the story side of improv? And it became a track for me. Well, I got about 45 minutes into my presentation and this guy in the back was like crossed his arms and finally raised his hand and was like, can you define what you mean by story?
Yeah.
And I was like, he's a doctoral student who engaged that way. But it was really a great question. And so I went back and did a lot of research. And one of the places that I landed was Jerome Bruner, the cognitive psychologist, says story is meaning. It is. It's what our brain does all the time. So you give me some data, whether that's, I see a guy standing there and then a woman standing there not facing each other. I make up a story in my head. Anytime I'm connecting things, I'm making up a story. So in a very fundamental way, we can't not tell story. The question becomes not, am I telling a story, but how consciously am I crafting my story? Or what story am I telling? Is it the story I want my audience to be hearing? So just sort of circling back to this idea of data.
Yeah.
Data is one kind of color. and or it's the relation, it's an advancing, right? So if you say this is where we used to be and this is where we are now, that's a story, right? Things used to be great, now they're terrible. Things used to be terrible, now they're great. We've made a little bit, right? That's the story. All of a sudden there's a meaning there that's a story. Any other data that you have is detail. And the question becomes, what data am I choosing and why? And the answer to both those questions need to be, for this audience, I'm going to move them to do what I want them to do differently.
Yeah. I love that, because that's exactly what it is. A story is meaning. That's at its essence. That's so true and so pure. And I think it's the purest definition I've ever heard, because that's what it is. And if you give out a lot of facts without context, it's not memorable. And you're actually the audience may walk away with a different interpretation than what you intended. But if you connect the dots for them in a way that's got that emotional conduit, that's what people remember. And there was a study at Stanford not too long ago that I used in a presentation I gave, and they actually studied this, and they found that they did a control group, and they found that when you wrapped data in a story, the story was remembered 22 times more.
Yeah.
And if you didn't, which is not really surprising. I mean, I think our brains are wired for stories, as we know, is because we're both storytellers. That's what it is.
So the story I make up when you say that is, the reason that's true is not because the information and data and the information and story are inherently different, but it's because you're linking it. You're turning it into meaning.
Yes.
You're making it sticky in a way that makes sense to me, right? So if I'm trying to remember your name, there's all sorts of ways I can do that. But one of our favorite activities, I'm sure you play this all the time, is to say, tell me the story of your name. How did you get your name? And I've realized when I'm doing workshops with people, if I get them to tell me the story of their name, I'll remember it.
Yeah. Yeah.
If they just tell it to me and I'm like, I have to remember their name. I have to remember their name. Kathy. It could be gone the next moment. But if I anchor it in meaning, in narrative, then it's sticky.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I was a good example that sort of reminds me of is, so I was at an event, a tech event years ago, and these data scientists were talking about how a lot of modern technology can reduce food spoilage, and they were throwing out figures and facts and figures and this and that and the other thing. And, I remember asking one of them, well, what would that translate into in terms of lives saved, do you think, if you reduced food spoilage by even 25%? Is 25% doable? I said, absolutely doable, because with better technology, you can track these things, and you can cut food spoilage, and food spoilage translates to lives. And I forget the number he told me, but it was powerful. It translated to millions of lives. I don't remember how many millions, but it was millions of lives. And I said, well, that's a story right there, because if you talk to me about technology all day long, my brain kind of I'm hearing it all day long. Tell me that a 25% reduction in food spoilage due to technology will translate to saving millions of lives in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Now you've got my attention, because you've quantified it in a human story.
That's right.
And now I'm remembering that much, much better than just the cold facts of the 25% reduction. And so there's ways,
beautiful,
as you say, to marry this in a human context.
That's right. We do, with our friends over at People Rocket, we do coaching at the Clinton Global Initiative every year for their on-site speakers. And they're all speeches, they're people like that who are saving the world, and they come to us, and many of them that we work with have 70 seconds to pitch. And they come to us with all of this data about all these amazing things they've done and how many millions of dollars and blah, blah. And the conversation we have with them is, why do you care about this?
Yeah.
Why are you involved? Why does it matter? Right? So a story about one of the ones I remember very similar to yours is someone who was talking about eradicating diarrhea. And it was like all this money, and we could do this. And I was like, wait, why do you why? And he's like, well, diarrhea kills 2 million children every year. And I said, wow, and why did you get involved with this? Why do you care? And he said, well, it's a 19th century disease. We know exactly how to cure it. It is a crime that we're letting this happen because we know how to cure it easily and cheaply. And I was like, okay, say that. Right?
Yes.
Because that is going to get so much more engagement from people than, here's our technology and here's how much money we've raised.
Right.
And in 77, and then his partner said to us, wow, the difference, a few words, a difference in frame, a few words make the difference between $100,000 worth of funding and $100 million worth of funding.
Absolutely. No question about it. No question about it. What's the larger human story and what's the larger narrative, I think, for what that means? And so when we're thinking about this kind of stuff, how do we, where do, in your work, do applied improvisational techniques kind of come in? So if you're talking to people and saying, you need to kind of wrap this in a story, we both agree it's important. Where do you start them thinking about that? Because I think people who can be very data oriented, sometimes it's challenging for them to get their arms around that story. So where do you start with them usually?
Great. So I think there are a few points of entry. The first is really this conversation we're having right now, which is making the case for story and shifting a mindset so that people aren't like, ooh, story, that's for children, or that's touchy-feely, or that's too soft, right? So for example, if we're working with, along with our friends at Fitch, we do some presentation coaching for Apple for their engineers who are presenting at the Worldwide Developers Conference. And when you get an engineer in to talk about the new specs for an app, he's a very attentive audience. He has to make it coherent and meaningful. And so he's not going to tell stories about, his childhood vacation. Right. And he still has to look at this data that he has and make it a narrative. Say, here's what we've done. Here's why we did it. Here's the impact of that. Here's why you care. And here's going to be the happily ever after if you now do things in this way. So that's the first thing, is making the case. The second is, in terms of improv, there are then two things that we need to help people do. One is literally figure out what makes a good story. So we can pull from the world of improv techniques and activities that are about, here's the structure of a well-made story, and here's how you add detail, and here's how you can play with adding different detail, and here's how you can really connect with your audience and understand them and align your choices, not just about what story, but how you tell your story with your audience. All of that stuff is around making the story. And then the other part of applied improv is exercising people's muscles around being storytellers. So how do you perform your story in a way that is effective and resonant and connected to your audience? And how do you expand your range of the kinds of stories that you're able to tell? And then I guess a fourth piece is, how do you get better at harvesting stories, at sort of hearing and receiving and remembering and then relating other stories that you hear?
And I love that you describe it that way, because it's so true. I think where improv can really make a difference, and I know you've seen it, and you're, for people out there that are listening that are wondering and don't have the improv background, it's so true. I love that you break it out, because it is so much of it is thinking the way that you frame the story, then the way that you design that story, and then the way you deliver that story in the world. Beautiful. And be a really present storyteller. So it's how am I thinking about it? How am I creating it? Then how am I delivering it as an effective storyteller to really connect in a really amazing way with my audience? And I know you probably do this too. And I've even used that beautiful step story model, the story spine, just getting people started with the universal of, once upon a time. And then one day this happened, and, because of that, then this happened, then this happened, and then this happened, and because of that, and ever since that day, blah blah blah, happily ever after. But and it seems like such a, one of my clients laughed and said, this is storytelling training wheels. And I said, but it works. And then when you take it off, change the language, take out the once upon a time, it's helped you think through the arc.
That is exactly right. It's a critical thinking tool, like all writing, right?
Yeah.
To be able to write well, you have to be able to think well.
Yeah.
And so can I pontificate? Can I sort of
absolutely
wax rhapsodic about the story spine for a minute?
You go, girl.
Because I really think it's an exciting and magical tool, and it continues to be one of my clients' one of the things that my clients like the most globally of anything that I bring in any training or coaching.
Agreed. Yeah.
So, and what I think is interesting about it, we call it the spine on purpose. And it's a little different from training wheels, which are something that you stick on the outside. The words, perhaps, are training wheels. But what's amazing about the story spine is that it encapsulates this core innate way that our brains want the narrative to go, at least in Western cultures. From the time of Aristotle, this is what a well-made story is. So it's really just, here's the platform or the routine. Here's the catalyst that breaks it. Here are the consequences. And it's important that they're consequences, not just random other things, right? Everything's tied together, cause and effect. Then until you get to this climax that breaks whatever tension or answers whatever question has been raised. And then you have your new routine, your new resolution and platform. So it was, and I always try to say, Ken Adams, who wrote the wonderful How to Improvise a Full Play book and has a improv company out in the Bay Area called Synergy Theater, created the story spine, wrote those words down from his vantage point as a playwright, because he wanted groups of improvisers to be able to improvise stories together. Full-length plays, one narrative, 6 actors, each playing only one character. So no safety net. In real time, we had to be able to tell a story. So he created the story spine for us to really drill into us. These are the beats of a story. These are what, if you don't do this, audiences will try to fill it in for themselves. Yeah. And 2 things will happen. Either they'll go like, oh, there was some ambiguity there and I loved it and I filled it in myself, and they'll write their own story. Or they'll just get annoyed and say that wasn't satisfying.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
you certainly don't want the annoyance. You probably, if you have a pitch, don't even really want them making up their own story.
No, you want to lead them to that.
You want to lead it to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And I think, I think about like a lot of my technical clients and people that I've worked with, and, they will jokingly call it training wheels, but they'll also come back and admit that it works. And that's the thing. It works for the reason you just said. It's how our brains want to think about it. And it brings you to that full arc of what has changed. And because of this, something has to shift. Something has to change. So if you're talking about your platform or your product as a solution, well, what in the world was broken, and what are the consequences if it's not fixed? And because of what this happened. And so, I always tell them, you can always change those words, but while you're still learning this spine, go with those words, use them exactly, because it will walk you through that full narrative. Then you can change the words, that's fine, but you'll end up with something that is memorable and makes sense. And,
that's right.
And even the doubting engineers will come back and go, that works. There's something to that.
And sometimes it's the engineers who like it best because it's a process.
Yes. It's a formula. That's it. They like that. They like a plan. They like a model.
It's also a great tool to story doctor a presentation. So sometimes if you have a presentation, you're like, I always miss this transition, or I don't know, I feel like I can't get from this slide to this slide, or I'm not sure why this is in there. If you try to map against the story spine, you'll say, oh, I get it. It's because I missed a thing. This doesn't happen because like I missed a transition, or you know what? I've got all this detail in here, but really we're just spinning our wheels and I don't need to say all this because really just this one point gets me to where I want to be.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to say it. It's a checklist to make sure you've thought through what's happening in your audience's mind so that they're sequential, this happened and this happened and this happened. And am I walking them through that in a way that they will get, does it make sense? And to make sure that you haven't left anything out. And one of the things I really love about it is, since I was first introduced to it through improv, and that's the funny thing is improv, it wasn't my branding background, it was improv. And I love the fact that it leads us to change and to this idea of arcing. And we know as performers on stage, how important that change is. Somebody or something or multiple people have to have changed by the end. And we want to see that change and shift in the way that, the audience now thinks about the issue because you've presented it that way.
And I think, Kathy, you're putting your finger on, storytelling aside, the core important thing to remember as a presenter, which is I have to know, more important than anything else that I know, what is it I want my audience to do differently when I am done presenting?
Yeah.
And that seems like such a simple question, and it is amazing how often that question doesn't get answered. And I want them to know XYZ isn't enough. Even I want them to feel XYZ isn't enough. You have to answer the question, what is it I want them to do? So I want them to know X because then they are going to be able to do Y, right? Or I want them to feel compassion because then they will donate money.
Yes.
Right? Or yes. I want them to buy my product. I want them to invest in my company. I want them to schedule the next meeting. I want them to, right? What is it I want them to do? I want them to talk about me to other people. I want them to leave feeling elated so that they spread the word, right?
Yeah.
And if you're doing that, then you recognize just what you were just saying, which is if I recognize that that's my intention, anytime I'm talking to anyone, really, certainly if I'm giving a formal presentation, then the idea that, so I have to have a narrative arc where something is different at the end than it is at the beginning, it becomes obvious, right? It becomes, of course I need to have a narrative arc.
Yeah.
Of course I need to follow this story spine, because that's what I'm asking people to do, is go on this journey where by the end of the presentation, they are changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think anytime, you've got an opportunity to do a presentation, you should think of it as a story. And I think that's really what this is about. And whether it's a story, as you said in the beginning of this conversation, it's whether it's really short and you usually don't have a lot of time to grab people's attention, or it's a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. How can you use stories? And I think that applies not just for external presentations. Anytime you've got an internal presentation, anytime you can think of a story that'll make your point, get people to feel something and then think and do something different. But I think it really starts with the conduit of emotions. It's am I really touching them in a way that they will have that change? And I'm happy to go ahead. Yeah.
No, just that it makes it sticky and have impact.
Sticky.
That's what emotion is about, right? I mean, it's we remember it, we understand it, we are attracted to it, or repelled by something in much more holistic ways when we involve emotions. Mm-hmm. And there's all sorts of research of various kinds on, what comes first, our thoughts or our emotions. And the more we learn about the brain, it seems more and more that we have an impulse.
Yes.
And then we rationalize why.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. That's what the research is telling us. It's really interesting. And even what we're seeing with, Google did a big study a couple of years ago. And I just laughed when the headline came out, because it was, we spent this money, we did this research, and we found that, the personal benefit and the outweighed the business benefit for executives when they're making a purchasing decision. And that was the headline. And I laughed because I thought, well, ask a storyteller, and they already knew that. Duh. And so it just kind of proved the point that I think a lot of us know, is that, it really does not matter if it's I think we're winning that war. About 5 years ago, I think there was still a lot of B2B was saying, well, we're different. And I was like, nah, you're really not, because you're still dealing with people at the end of the day. So you're not different. You're not different. And I'm happy to say that, these silly studies aside, and they're not silly in the sense that they're important, but they're silly in that I think we already know in our gut and our heart of hearts that stories matter. We already know that. But I think there's more acceptance in the B2B world of, hey, it doesn't matter if there's a purchasing decision and it's technical stuff. There's still a story, and that person is feeling some personal risk. They're making an emotional buying decision, and then they're rationalizing it with the facts later. So we've got to provide that personal benefit, that emotional core that says they're there. This purchase is going to be okay. It's going to make you look good. It's that warm hug that a story gives that just the facts are not going to give.
Right. Well, facts don't have any meaning unless they're connected to something, right? That's when people make fun of statistics, right? You can kind of make the facts what you want. And I'm not saying that there's no such thing as truth, because I don't believe that. I'm not saying that data isn't important at all.
Right.
What I'm saying is that, this person that you're talking to is going to need very different facts and data to feel inspired and feel comfortable and feel understood and feel confident than this person, right? If I'm talking to the CTO, it's a different conversation than if I'm talking to the CFO, or if I'm talking to the director of marketing, right? Or a salesperson. Like those are different audiences. And the story that I need to tell them, even if it's the same data, is different. Mm-hmm. Because the meaning comes in between us, right? So if I'm trying to influence you and you really care about the budget numbers, then that's the color I need to put into my story, or that's the story I need to tell, how this is going to save you money.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was just having this conversation yesterday with somebody, and data does matter. We're totally in agreement. We're not saying, for those folks listening, that data is not important. It absolutely is. But I think when we sort of let data become more important than the story, we've lost some context. So I was having a discussion with an HR person, and they had been studying a problem where they were losing talent to younger, more nimble, more innovative startups, and they were a bigger tech company in the Valley, and they studied this problem for a year to try to get the data. And I said, well, what did you come to the conclusion on? And she said with a straight face, God bless her, she said, the data shows that people want to do meaningful work. That's what the data says. And I just chuckled. I couldn't help it. And I said, no, I'm totally behind you on the data. I get it. It's just, I think like a year ago, we probably already knew that viscerally, and we maybe didn't need to spend the money. And she's like, I'm with you, Kathy, but here executives want the data. And that's where, we need, the data is fine, and we need to elevate it to the execs, but the story wrapper has to be one of urgency, that look, morale is an issue. People want to do meaningful work. And when you don't provide it to them, they will leave. That's the story. Oh, and by the way, here's the data that supports that. And so it's okay to have the data as long as the data doesn't get in the way of the urgency of the story that we need to be telling.
I feel like there's a yes to all of that. I feel like there's a way that data and story get pitted against each other, or sort of like they're different things. And I think one of the principles that I'm out there preaching is they aren't different things. So when you're thinking about telling a story, the question isn't story or data. The question is, what data do I need to make this a meaningful, robust, believable, influential story? There's a dark side to all of this, right? Too, when and it's why I'm saying, I'm not saying there's no such thing as truth, but you can manipulate data. You can influence people with story that is not true.
Right.
But the flip side of that is you can be really super rigorous about your data and articulate it in a way that is a meaningful, influential, powerful story and still is data-based, right? So I think that distinction is an unfortunate one. You know, the work that Alan Alda is doing with scientists right now around storytelling is just to this point, because he was saying people aren't valuing science because they don't understand it. So you can do all this, you can have all these experiments and have all this data in the world, but if you cannot articulate it in a way that is understandable and meaningful to people, people aren't going to care, and they're not going to invest in you, and they're not going to buy it, right? If we don't have, you know, the going to the moon narrative, or the we're going to save babies narrative, or or this makes sense to me, so I can talk about it, then you're going to lose the battle of science or something else.
Right.
And I think where scientists get scared is they don't want to, and this was the whole sort of brouhaha around the Malcolm Gladwell stuff, is they're like, don't make me fudge my data so that it's a better story. And what I believe, and sort of what I want us to all create together, is a place where we are not sacrificing the rigor of our data for a good story, but we're also not sacrificing really good, compelling, meaningful communication because we're stopping with numbers.
Yeah.
Is that?
Absolutely. No, well said. I mean, I'm definitely in your camp. The two go together. They're not disjointed, and they're not diametrically opposed. You need both. It's the story of 25% reduction of food spoilage or millions of lives saved. It's that difference. You need that to tell that story.
And I think both of those kinds of.
You need both of those. You need both, because you need the human narrative that goes, oh my gosh, millions of lives potentially saved. That is an emotional core. And you need the 25%, and you need the number of lives saved, because you need to quantify the problem to say, here's what's at stake if we don't solve it. And so you need both those to go cooperatively. And it's also the climate change thing. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations, actually, interestingly enough, with I've met a few NASA climatologists. My husband works at NASA. And, it's interesting to hear the community talk about it. And their frustration is really that the science is there and the story is there. But the way the story got told it was all about the facts. And the story of what would happen to human beings wasn't layered on top of it to make people go, oh my God, this is urgent. This is, oh my gosh. So now you have the naysayers disputing facts. It's a much harder thing for those naysayers to dispute a human narrative.
Right.
But that was not woven. And so the frustration of the climatologists to hear them talk is, there's a human narrative here. I mean, our survival as a species is at stake here, but we're not telling the story in a way that we're scaring people, but we're not saying, look, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do better. And we're scaring people. We're not giving them hope. And so the climatologists are so frustrated. They're like,
We're scaring people, and we're shaming people. Michael Margolis from Get Storied has great work around this. And, one of the things that he says is you have to have your audience, you have to let them into your story in a way that they're willing to hear it. Yeah. And if you start telling a story that is going to put up walls and make people defensive, that's what's happening, I think, is that, they're like, well, what we don't have is the story of what we can do, really, right? People don't believe that there's anything we can do. So you either go like, no, I'm not going to listen to that data because I'm not buying that story. It's too scary. Or you're like, oh crap, I'm terribly depressed. And, it's a very,
that's scary. And into, Michael's work that we both are familiar with, it does not give much optimism and hope for the future. And part of what storytelling needs to do, I think, is really good storytelling with what we're talking about with story arcs is people want to see that there's optimism and there's hope. and that they can do something. They can be part of the solution. And facts that scare people, they may work in the short run to get everybody worked up, but they don't have a sustainable long-term effect. And I think that's what we're talking about. If you want people to really be changed by it, make that a hopeful one that's has an optimistic future, that, to your point, people can see themselves as part of that solution, part of that story.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think of when you're saying this is there are many, many out there, and we're started by talking about the balkanization of this field. There are many, many thoughts about story structure. There are many, many thoughts about what kinds of stories you should be telling, and you have to have these core stories. There are many, many thoughts about, both in business and in the world of storytelling, about what makes a good story. To me, all of those are potential tools, and the answers can be debated, or you can disagree about the answers. The questions are what's important to me. So when I'm teaching people about storytelling, I want to say, okay, what's your intention? What's the moral of your story? What is it you want people to do differently, right? If we're talking about an environment where we're giving a presentation to move someone, right? Mm-hmm. So what is it you want to do them differently? Great. So what's the moral of this story? What do they need to know or feel? Great. So here's the moral. How do you prove that moral through your story? And who are you talking to? So like, what's the information? What's the data? What's the detail that this audience is going to need to get them to go where you want them to go? And that can be a story of hope. It can be a horror story. It can be a story of a future apocalypse or utopia. It can be a story from the past, examples. It can be a personal story. It can be a very scientifically based, data-based story, narrative, right? Here's where we were in 1995. We made these changes in the factory, and now here's where we are today. But circling back, to me, the underlying thing about story is to stop asking the question whether or not we should use story and start asking the question, how am I using story?
Yeah.
So not if I tell a story, but what story? Not, right?
Yeah. I think the battle has been sort of fought and won on that. It's like, awesome. Exactly. I think it's really, you've got to tell a story. And the question that I think we're kind of getting to is, or where we're coming to is, how do you start? And I think, as you said earlier, it's, what do you want, who's your audience? What do you want them to think, feel, and do? How do you want them to be changed by the story? What is it you want them to walk away with? And do you have that beginning, middle, and end? Whether you use the 7-step story spine that you and I are familiar with, or you use some other model, how are you walking people through, here's how it is today, but because of that, here's what broke, here's the consequences of a broken system, status quo, whatever, here's how things can change and could be, a vision of what could be, and because of that, here's what could also be, and ever since that day, here's maybe where the hope or the ultimate world can be,
positive version of that.
Yeah, and those are the things that I think people need to start thinking about when they have a presentation to do, of how they can have that full story arc. I mean, anything you'd add to that? Because I know there's story's so big. It's so big,
Right? I mean, once you start by saying story's meaning, then you're like, okay, so.
It is. It's the meaning of life, of all life, people.
One of the thoughts I have about that is to recognize that story is fractal for those scientists out there, right? So if I'm giving a presentation, one story is, what is the story of my presentation, which is really what we've been talking about. Yeah. Right? So what is the narrative arc of my presentation? Mm-hmm. And then once I have that, I can say, okay, so here at the beginning of my story, I'm talking about our current state and where we are. Well, I might have to have a couple of stories in that part of my story arc, right? Yes. So I might have a story about, I talked to Joe in accounting and this is what he said he noticed, right? Or I talked to, Smith on the line and he noticed that everybody was getting carpal tunnel syndrome because of this, and right? Or here's a story of what our competitors are currently doing. Or here's a story that we heard from a customer about what they're wanting and needing. And that's all under the umbrella of this first block of our current state when the story begins, our once upon a time and every day.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now we move on to, but this is what we're going to suggest, right? Or here's the change we want to make. And then maybe we have stories of other companies who've made those changes, or, right?
Yeah.
So it can be fractal.
It can be. It's absolutely fractal. It's a great way to put it, because you're absolutely right. There's the big overarching sort of like, here's the arc, you're right, the presentation, and then here's the mindset, here's the content we talked about before, and your content should be stories. We're getting kind of meta about story. We're like story and story. Right. We're getting meta. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Right. But that's it, right? So again, that's why I keep coming back to, the question isn't, am I telling a story, or am I going to use a story? The question is how and where and why. What is my intention?
Yeah. And delivery, and how, and to your point too, I don't want to miss this opportunity to kind of bring it back. I think how you deliver as a storyteller is really important, because you really want to be very present in your story to make your point. And it's, how you deliver that can be just as impactful as the content of what you say, as we both know.
That's right.
So those are all key things. What are some great stories that you've heard? Have you heard any presentations lately where you thought, maybe going back to some of these tech presentations you've heard, or not outside of tech, that you went, wow, that really encapsulated that narrative pretty quickly?
One of my favorites is a story that I heard from a Paralympic athlete. So I was working with the Paralympic Committee, right? The USOC, the Olympic Committee, with their Paralympic athletes who were ambassadors for the program. And the Paralympics, if any of your audience doesn't know, are the elite disabled athletes. So this isn't the Special Olympics. These are super elite athletes. And the games are done in parallel to the Olympic Games every year. They finally, in the last few rounds, have been getting more attention and being televised in a way that they weren't a number of years ago when I was working with them. But I went with our colleagues at Performance of a Lifetime, and I was helping to do some media training and specifically storytelling with these athletes. And what was interesting, we taught them the story spine, we taught them color advance. What was interesting at the beginning of these days that we had with them is, these are the most inspiring, most powerful stories that anyone could tell, right?
Yeah.
I was fighting in a war and my legs were blown off. And then I came back from, this terrible, devastating tragedy and worked my way back up and, finally became an Olympic athlete. Now I've won a gold medal and I'm a hero. And you can do it too. As quote, inspiring as these stories were, they were also, and we said this together, so I feel like I can say it, they were a little cliche. They were a little predictable.
Yeah.
So one of the things we worked on, which is the other objection people sometimes have to the story spine. So what we worked on was, the story spine is a spine, right? It's like your spine. If we took our skin and bodies off and just had our spines, we would look really similar. And, a room full of spines would not be especially differentiated or interesting.
Yeah.
But you can still need a spine to have a person.
Yes.
So we started to ask them questions like, what do you really care about? What is your message? What feels meaningful to you personally? That is the advice you would give or that you would tell someone. And coming back to your question, one of the athletes told this story, and he's given me permission to retell it, which was he'd been a daredevil and really athletic all of his life. He'd wanted to be a cyclist, professional cyclist, but he didn't feel like he was good enough at it. So he didn't really pursue it in any kind of serious way. And one day, once upon a time, he was out backwoods skiing with some friends. And they got caught in an avalanche. And he was badly injured and had to have his leg amputated. And so the place he started the story then was that. He said, once upon a time, I had my leg amputated and I had this really long, awful recovery. And every day for months, I would sit in my living room after I got home from the hospital and lie on the couch and be in pain and weak and depressed. And maybe I'd crawl to the bathroom. That was my big event for the day. And I'd go to the bathroom and then I'd sit there for 45 minutes to rest before I crawled back to the couch. And this went on and on. But one day, my wife pulled out my bike and she set up the stationary stand and she put my bike on it and she said, "Get on." And because of that, he said, I was horrified and angry. And I was like, "What are you, crazy? Look at me." And she yelled at me and said, "Get on the bike." And we had this fight. And finally she dragged a chair over and picked me up and set me on the bike and set my stump on the chair and said, "Pedal." And just to get her off my back, I was like, fine. So I pedaled and he said I went about 2 minutes and then nearly collapsed. She had to like catch me and carry me back to the couch. And then she stood there and was like, "So, how was that?" Looking very proud. And I was like, it was terrible. I did like 2 minutes. I used to be able to do hundreds of miles a day, 16 hours a day. It was 2 minutes. And she looked at me and she said, "Yeah? How long did you do yesterday?"
Yeah. Yeah.
She said, and I realized in that moment that I always needed to celebrate the 2 minutes.
Yeah. It's a great story.
It's a great story.
It's a great story.
It's a great story.
It is. And it's a great demonstration of using the spine, but the spine, you still have to add color and flesh out the spine and be vulnerable. And
what story you're telling, right? He didn't say I was this once upon a time was an athlete, but one day I was in an avalanche, and because of that I was in the hospital, and here was all the data about how they treated me and what my injuries were, until finally I got better or I discovered the Paralympics. Because that we know that story. He made it really small,
little victory,
and detailed, right?
Yeah,
and then victory. The last thing about that, in terms of the what he discovered as he was discovering that having meaning for himself, was he discovered what is the message I want to give the world and who do I want to talk to. So he uses that story in two ways, depending on who his audience is. One is when he's talking to other athletes who are in recovery or injured folks. He gives them the message of you need to celebrate the 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. It's not about, you don't win a gold. The goal isn't winning a gold medal. The goal is more than yesterday, and you're competing against yourself. And the other place he uses the story is with families of folks who are injured. Yeah. And when he tells that story to them, it's about sometimes you have to push, right? And sometimes we care so much, and we have such empathy that we coddle and we enable. And there's a time for that. And there's also a time, and you'll know, to be like, to push a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love it because it is, to your point, exactly. It gets you out of this sort of expected arc. And it's to a micro story where it's that little victory. You're right. You're starting in the middle of the story. And I think it's an unexpected story that not everybody will tell. And I love it. I love that. And because it's a little victory, it's actually a big emotional current. And that's huge. It can sometimes, I think, if we extrapolate, you can make one really good, solid point, but if you keep your story, focused, you can have this huge impact. Your story doesn't have to take on the world and do 3, 4, 5 different things. The focus of it, and I love that. And the spine is just, as you said, it's just there to get us the basics, but flesh that out to something people might not expect. And I love the vulnerability in telling that story, which I think is another key thing. If you really want to have an emotional impact, the vulnerability to be able to say things like that, I think, is pretty huge. Right. Yeah.
And it's his, right? It's his.
It's his. Yeah.
Nobody else can tell that story. I mean, I just told it to you. it's still it's his.
But no, and you did a great job as his sort of proxy, but I mean, how much more power, and it was a powerful story, you telling it. So I can only imagine him telling that story and really own that story in a way that's really personal and having that personal thing. And I think even in business, there is that personal element. And it's, how does it relate to you? We really want to see a piece of somebody in that story. We want to see that human part of that story.
Yeah.
If you could just leave one kind of parting thought, because there's so many great things here that we've talked about, and I love this topic. I love talking with you about it. It's just, story's huge. So what parting thought would you give to people out there who are thinking about, the presentations as stories and the big spine, but also the little stories within that? What would you say?
Here's what I would say. The first is trust that you are a good storyteller. This is an innate ability. So everything we're talking about, all these tools, are about making conscious what you're already doing.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking, oh, I'm not a good storyteller, it's not true, you are. And if we had more time, I'd prove it to you. Or email me and I'll prove it to you. Call me up, I'll prove it to you. So one is, you are a good storyteller. And then the second is this thing that I keep coming back to, is stop asking the question, should I use story? And start asking the question, how am I going to use story?
I love it. And if I could just leave one thing that I've learned over the years, just one thing about storytelling is, even in business, the more you can tell that story through a personal lens, and even if it's a piece of software, what motivated you to come with that software? What personal problem did it solve for you that you thought maybe other people have the same problem I have? If you can weave that personal thread into it, how much more powerful will your story be? I think that's something, again, small things can have these big effects.
Amen, sister.
Amen. I feel like world peace should be next. We should be able to tackle that next.
We're working on it. As a community, there's all sorts of people out there doing improv to save the world.
I know.
Circles for peace.
I think it's great, and I've got some other ideas. You're going to have to do a follow-up on this, Kat, because we've got more to discuss.
Awesome.
I want to do this with you. I think it's fun. Now, where can people find you, Kat, and where's the best place to get a hold of you?
So my website is koppett.com. I think it's right down there. It's KOPPETT.com, and you can find me there. I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter at Kopco, I think is the Twitter handle.
And that's Kopco with a K, Kopco. There you go. I'm Kathy Klotz-Guest. You can find me at keepingithuman.com. I actually have a book coming out. I am co-writing a book with Brian Carter on business storytelling, and this is just such a huge passion for me and for Kat, as you can see, and look for more good stuff to come. We're going to have you back, Kat. That's just the way it is.
Anytime.
Well, you're fun. You're so much fun to talk to. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.